gentleman behind, yeah. Right.
Hi, Carl Gollivan, domain reference and idealliveson.net. As a reference for my question, two references. Benjamin Friedman, at age 71, gave a talk at the Willard Hotel here in DC in 1961. He was connected in the Wilson administration. He was actually present in Versailles in 1919. Secondly, a book, The Controversy of Zion, by journalist Douglas Reed, written in 1956, not published until 1978. You mentioned the money power circa 1900. Arguably, the money power is named in the person to whom the Balfour Declaration was addressed. And Friedman would argue that the Balfour Declaration
So what is the question? Is
laying a foundation.
Yeah,
briefly.
we have very limited time, so
Okay.
just...
The Balfour Declaration, was it not negotiated as a reward for bringing the U.S. into the war by Zionist interests? And Reed would argue that the roots and objectives of both Bolshevism and Zionism were inextricably intertwined.
All right, I think we got it.
Very briefly, and I don't want to be misunderstood here, it's no doubt at all that in the minds of anti-Semitic British statesmen in 1917 who were trying to make sense of the world and were reading the London Times, whose reporter in Russia in 1917 was a profoundly anti-Semitic British reporter, and who attributed the influence of the world Jewish conspiracy to the undermining of Tsarism and the advent of Bolshevism. In the minds of people who have that kind of framework of analyzing the world, there is indeed a connection between the influence of Jewish bankers and American policy. And there is already, on the part of British policymakers, an expectation that if you cut a deal like this by way of figures like Brandeis, you will be able to gain some kind of purchase over Washington. And it is framed quite explicitly in those terms as a bid for the opinion of world Jewry, in which, of course, Zionist activists have an interest in cultivating the idea that such a thing exists and that it does, in fact, have some influence, because by means of that idea, you can, in fact, then exercise leverage over decision makers in London and in New York and Washington. But you have to insist that those constructions, that architecture, is framed by a pre-existing anti-Semitism that starts on the basis of the existence of that. Within that context, those linkages are real, they're documented, there is no doubt at all that that is what the decision makers in London thought they were doing. We also know the work that the Zionist organizations around the world had to do to suppress protests from Jewish communities across the world against the Balfour Declaration, notably in revolutionary Russia, where an association of the largest Jewish community in the world with an imperialist promise of a Palestinian homeland at the expense of the Ottoman Empire at this particular moment would have been devastating for their revolutionary credentials. A government had just fallen in Petrograd precisely over that issue, its willingness to uphold early war commitments to imperialism against the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. And so Zionist actors in both London and Washington have to do a huge amount of work to silence the news of the fact that huge assemblies of Russian Jews had voted against approving this. So it's a hugely complex force field in which the virus of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is operating in an extraordinary polysemous kind of way, having meaning for lots of different actors at lots of different places.